Good morning and welcome back. Today with us, we have the lovely Olivia Bennett. I'm Jess, obviously, and Olivia's on the show today. She's a registered dietitian specializing in fertility, maternity, and postpartum nutrition, with several years of experience in the NHS in clinical nutrition and having specialized in weight management and diabetes. She left the NHS to start her own practice in order to meet the needs of more women. And she's committed as a dietitian to sharing up-to-date information backed by science and really working with women of all different ages to really reach their goals. So welcome to the show, firstly.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on here.
And yeah, I guess I'd love to also, as I do with all my guests, hear a bit more about yourself and I kind of whizzed over your background there, but a bit more about yourself and how you kind of got into what you're doing now.
Yeah, amazing. So I grew up in North Devon in southwest England, and I was very outdoorsy, loved surfing and kind of spending as much time outdoors as I could. And I always thought that I would go into a career that was outdoors based.
Mm.
But really enjoyed cooking growing up, and my mum encouraged me to kind of cook as much as I could. And I got more and more interested in nutrition and how the foods that we eat like affect our health and why we choose to eat them. And so I ended up going to study nutrition and dietetics. So I moved to Cardiff in South Wales to study there. And then when I graduated, I worked in hospital in Wales for a few years and then moved back to North Devon. I was working in hospital as a registered dietitian in North Devon when I specialised in weight management and diabetes. It was really interesting, and I had so much fun working, especially with all the women with gestational diabetes, so whilst they're pregnant. And there was just a few cases where there was women that I felt were not supported enough by the system, and so it kind of broke my heart that would happen. These were women who were at a really crucial point in their life, and they could make changes that were going to affect not just them, but like a whole nother generation.
Mm.
And they just didn't have the support there that they kind of needed or even wanted. Which is part of the reason why I left the NHS, took a step back for a while, went traveling and spent a lot of time, just surfing and being very outdoors. And then, started my own freelance or like private practice. And I specialize now in supporting women who are trying to become pregnant, or who are pregnant or who have just had their babies, and some like polycystic ovary syndrome and endometriosis and menopause work as well. So yeah.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. Congrats. How have you found the kind of change from NHS to more your own freelance work?
It's been a really, I think, eye-opening.
Yeah.
I think working for the NHS was incredible, and I would not change my experience there for the world. And I've always been fortunate to work in really good teams and have really good colleagues, kind of who are not just dietitians, but speech and language therapists, physiotherapists, doctors, nurses are all so, so important. But with the NHS, it was just, I guess, like an onslaught of people who needed to be seen and needed to be seen urgently. And so we didn't have, as much as I would have liked, the time and capacity for like service change or like providing really what was needed on top of, there was no time for prevention. It was just a lot of needing to treat people who were like in an emergency situation. And then kind of stepping away from that has been really different, because people come to me when they have time to make changes, and it's not necessarily an emergency, but it's like a really like they have a really good understanding of how important these changes are for their health.
Mm.
And it's really nice to work with people who are really enthusiastic to work with me. Although no doubt it has been daunting to kind of be going solo and be on my own and not have that kind of umbrella or that cushion of having the NHS kind of behind me.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like the work that you do is so good in actually preventing people from having to use the NHS when they're in crisis. I think that it's so good, that preventative role, and that people, you can really work with people before it gets to that stage. So that must be really satisfying.
Yeah, I think that's the idea, is that I'd love to be the first step rather than the last step.
Mm.
And that's kind of, yeah, what we're aiming for, I
Yeah,
guess.
definitely. Kind of on that topic, you obviously work a lot with diet, lifestyle, and nutrition. And what kind of, for listeners or viewers, what kind of role do you think diet plays in fertility? And what kind of advice do you normally give surrounding diet and fertility?
I think it's one of those things that for a while now, people have kind of been recognizing more and more the role of diet in fertility and the role of good nutrition on fertility. But it's such a small and niche area. Obviously, when we move in these circles and we communicate with a lot of other like fertility practitioners or people on their fertility journeys, it can become a real echo chamber of people who know.
Mm.
But I think even when I kind of started on my like freelance business, even my mum was like, is that a thing that's necessary? Like, can your nutrition change your fertility? Is that a thing? And like my mum is very clued up, so I was surprised that it was a question that she asked. But yeah, there is so many factors that can influence our fertility, some of which obviously we can't change. So like our genetics and our diet, our genetics and our age, we can't change, and they are what they are. But there's so many other things that we can change about our lifestyle and about our nutrition that impact our fertility. So like our nutrition is definitely one of them, and like our exercise and our stress levels all play a role. And if we can do what we can to manage those factors that we have control over, we do put ourselves in good stead for like improving or maintaining our fertility.
Mm.
In terms of like for women, obviously we are born with all the eggs that we're ever going to have. So we can't say, oh yeah, eat this food and you'll generate way more eggs, because that's just not scientifically possible. But what we can do is improve the quality of the eggs that we have that are maturing. So we have loads of eggs in our ovaries that are maturing at any one time, and they'll take kind of like 90 to 120 days to mature. And during that period, we can influence kind of how they grow and the quality of them, and to give ourselves the best chance.
Yeah, completely agreed. I mean, we do a lot of work with that as well at Screamy, where it's like that holistic approach where it really is what you're putting into your body. Shock horror has an influence on what your health is and what the health of your egg health is. So I think I completely agree that the sooner that people kind of realize that more and kind of take a more of a proactive approach to it, I think it will really improve fertility chances without then having to go down the route of, say, expensive IVF or expensive fertility treatments. And so I think, yeah, starting with yourself and what you do with your own body, I think is the great way to start. So if I was coming to you with like wanting to know more about my fertility and nutrition, and I was to say, look, okay, I'm starting from scratch, what would be your first like piece of advice? Like what would be the major thing that you would change in your diet to improve your fertility?
So I think obviously everyone comes to me or their fertility practitioner from very different places, and it's totally going to depend on like you and your health. And there's definitely not one rule for like a one size fits all. But I guess in terms of in like the majority of the people that I speak with, I'd say if you were to make one like dietary change, it would probably be to have like more whole grains in your diet, or kind of change out some of your like really refined carbohydrates for more whole grain versions. I think it's something that is really doable for most people. Like even in terms of the bread that you buy, if you were going to go for a wholemeal bread rather than a white bread, in terms of rice, it's not too difficult to choose brown over white. And if you have like the time and means to cook quinoa or any kind of like lentil rather than having a wrap, that's like a really simple swap that's really beneficial. Having the whole grain versions or the wholemeal versions just means that we're giving our body a bit more fiber. which is useful for a whole bunch of different reasons. So if we are someone with endometriosis, we know that we are much more likely than someone without endometriosis to have IBS, and maintaining a good fiber intake can really help regulate those IBS symptoms. If you're someone with PCOS, having more whole grains is really useful because that fiber, again, can just help maintain a bit more of a regular blood glucose level. So I guess to note that everyone's blood glucose goes up and down, and that is a normal part of our digestion. But sometimes with PCOS, we find that our blood glucose goes really high and much lower, and really high and much lower. And we just want to take that like big swing and just make it more of like an even keel. And fiber is really good for helping with that because it helps slow down how quickly we absorb like the carbohydrate from the food. And then for everyone, especially if we're thinking about fertility, having whole grains means that we have a really good source of vitamin B, or like lots of our different B vitamins in our diet. And they can be really useful for making sure that our like endometrious lining is nice and thick, which is going to help implantation.
Oh, that sounds great. I think that would be really useful for listeners as well. And I think, what role do you think that, say, supplements come into this preconception journey?
I'd say that probably the thing that I was taught a long time ago, and which kind of has stuck with me, is that like a poor diet with a supplement is still essentially a poor diet. So like a supplement won't fix everything. But the kind of research is there and the studies are there that show that if there is gaps in what we are getting in terms of our overall nutrients, then actually still having a like preconception or like pregnancy supplement is really useful just to plug a few of those gaps. So I'd say supplements in preconception and pregnancy are really useful. If we are like, especially during pregnancy, going for a like pregnancy focused multivitamin is really useful just to make sure all of the nutrients in there are in like a safe range, because there's certain things that we can and can't tolerate whilst we're pregnant versus when we're not. So supplements I think are very useful just to cover kind of all bases. I think for anyone thinking about trying to get pregnant, or even if you're at the stage where you're like not trying but not trying, so you've like stopped contraception but you're not necessarily actively trying to have a child, then I'd say folic acid supplements are like the most important. They're meant to have them for like 3 months prior to becoming pregnant, but given that like I think it's about 45% of pregnancies in the UK are like unplanned. It's a lot of people who potentially don't have the supplement that they would benefit from. Say for most women of childbearing age who are not on contraception, then having a folic acid supplement is really really beneficial.
Yeah, definitely agreed. I think it's that case of really filling the gaps, isn't it? As you kind of said. And so I think understanding your body and seeing, oh, this is an area that I'm deficient in, and I should either supplement that or try and incorporate that into my diet a bit more. I think that's something that, yeah, we work a lot with our tests as well, where you kind of see what range you're in for everything and kind of determine what you kind of need from that. And then kind of transitioning into pregnancy, how does diet and nutrition, or how should that really change to maintain a healthy pregnancy? So I know there's a lot of things where it's like, oh, should you really be eating for two of you, and how this kind of changes. So like what advice do you give there?
Totally. It's one of those things, I think it's a classic of women who become pregnant, and I often associate it with like, oh, I've gone to see my grandma and she's given me an extra slice of cake because she's like, oh, you're eating for two, congratulations, here, have some extra. And that is generally really unhelpful. We definitely don't need to be eating for two when we're pregnant. We all know that there is probably some crazy cravings going on, and you might be fancying really different foods, and that's fine, but doesn't need to be double what we're used to. In our first and second trimester, the like research says that there's actually no need to increase our energy intake at all.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
a lot of people, yeah, a lot of people are very shocked about, because you're like, oh, I'm growing a whole human, like
Yeah.
surely I must need more. But there's nothing, like there's no literature to say that we do. Obviously, everyone is completely different, and especially if you're an active person or you're still maintaining like exercise and sports training and things like that, then you may well need more, and you hopefully can listen to your body and know whether you're hungry or full and satisfied, or kind of what's going on. I'd say listening to your body at that point is like very, very important. But yeah, science wise, there's no obvious need for more until we get to our third trimester, at which point generally you will need more energy than on your normal day to day if you weren't pregnant. But even then, it's only like 200 calories or so more, which when we think
Wow.
about it, it's like not that much. So I guess 200 calories is like 3 boiled eggs, or like one standard like protein bar, if that's kind
Yeah.
of what you're up for, or like 2 apples. So it's not that much more.
Oh, wow. That's really crazy. I think also, how over like each trimester would you say the diet should or needs to change to kind of support each stage of development?
So it's really interesting, some of the like research that's coming out now. There's no like formal recommendation at the moment, but in terms of like supplements and things on trimester versus trimester, um, initially the kind of recommendation, especially with folic acid, was that you supplement kind of for the first trimester and then stop. Um, but it's kind of, there's some more studies coming out that actually show if we maintain some of our folic acid supplementation, that our offspring have like higher IQs or more like cognitive development earlier on, which
Wow.
is really, could be really beneficial.
Hmm.
Um, so again, this is like developing research, and obviously research with pregnant women is really difficult because we can't change too much, or we can't
Yeah.
subject anyone to like a specific research group.
Hmm.
Um, so these developments in science are like slow and steady, but that's kind of one of the things that's coming to the forefront now, is that actually, have we been stopping our supplements too soon, or like could we benefit from more?
Hmm.
And that's one of the things that does seem to change trimester by trimester.
Oh, so interesting. And just in terms of not just the supplements, but the actual diet itself. So, is there a case for, oh, should I be eating more protein in this trimester or carbs in this trimester? Or how does that all kind of interplay, or does it not necessarily matter?
I'd say if you're having like a healthy, balanced diet generally, there's no need for more or less of one type of food,
Mhm.
um, like at any one stage.
Yeah.
Generally maintaining that kind of, if we've optimized our diet for fertility, a lot of the time, that is optimal for pregnancy as well.
Okay, got
So we will like continue what we're doing ideally,
it.
and focusing on like the whole grains, and having plenty of antioxidants, so plenty of lots of different colored foods, lots of different colored fruit and veg,
Mm-hmm.
is a really good way to go. And that is, I guess, consistent not only through like fertility and maternity, but also postpartum and then throughout our lives. If that's a good habit we can start when we're thinking about becoming pregnant, it's a really great habit to carry on with for like the rest of our life.
Yeah, I think that takes me really well into my next question, where it's like, how do you think the diet should then change postpartum? So, kind of as we've kind of gone through the fertility, preconception, then pregnancy, then postpartum, is there anything? I know it's obviously a massive strain on the body, so I don't know if there's anything that you need to be prioritizing or anything.
Yeah, so obviously like childbirth itself is a miracle in what it is, and such hard work for a human body to do. So obviously in that initial period after giving birth, there's like a lot of recovery, and a lot of healing that needs to be done. And then everyone's kind of journey with an infant is very different. If you are someone, especially who is breastfeeding, you'll find that you need a lot more fluid and often a lot more energy to maintain kind of healthy breastfeeding. Generally, we think it's about, well, you produce up to like a litre of breast milk per day. So it's likely that you're going to need at least a litre of extra fluids per day. And an extra like 500 calories or so is like the ideal for when we're breastfeeding on top of what is like our normal intake. We also do need a bit more protein and a bit more calcium whilst we're breastfeeding, because it's really important that we are nourishing ourselves as well as the milk that we're producing is of good quality. One of the tricky things that we find with women postpartum is that we've gone from being like very heavily pregnant, potentially quite uncomfortable, maybe we've stopped work, and our rest has increased, and then we suddenly have a child who requires lots of looking after, potentially lots of walking about, potentially lots of jiggling, lots of bouncing to help get them to sleep. And we often have people who want to come visit, and there's a lot of social pressure, and that is really, really draining and takes up a lot of energy. We do find that even in the difference versus like in the kind of activity in our day, we're often a lot more active like postpartum than we are just before we give birth. So that's one of the things to consider, is actually you're probably doing so much more, so you need to fuel yourself perhaps a bit more.
Yeah, definitely. And that also links to making sure you have that support network hopefully in place before. But I think, yeah, making sure you have the right nutrition to deal with that increase in energy is definitely a good place to start as well. And I guess also there's a lot of discussion kind of surrounding what you can and can't have during pregnancy and even postpartum. And I know caffeine is quite a hot topic in the sense of that. Where would you kind of stand on that debate?
It's a really tricky one, and obviously it kind of varies through the whole like cycle. Generally, if we're like thinking about getting pregnant and we're in that kind of fertility stage, then it's potentially useful even to kind of limit our caffeine in that time. There's no kind of set right or wrong. There's no set recommendation as such, but it has been seen that higher levels of caffeine intake in that kind of preconception stage are linked potentially to a higher early miscarriage risk. So if you are thinking about getting pregnant and are kind of pre-conception, I'd say it's probably a really good time to start figuring out what caffeine-free drinks you enjoy and how you might start changing your caffeine intake if you are a coffee drinker. Generally, kind of 200 milligrams is thought of like as the kind of limit for when we're pregnant. There's no limit of like what we would deem as safe, because there's nothing to say that it's necessarily safe to have that much. It's just not harm, I guess, is the wording. So 200 milligrams is like what we'd say is the limit for during pregnancy. So that's like, I guess, 1 and maybe a half good coffees, maybe 2 instant coffees, and like, yeah, a cup of tea and a half of normal tea. It's important to notice as well, perhaps, where our caffeine comes in that isn't in our, what we think of as like our caffeine-y drinks. So even sometimes in like painkillers, or sometimes in like other medications will have caffeine in there to kind of perk ourselves up through the day. So it's really important to notice there where caffeine is coming in aside from our caffeinated drinks. In that postpartum phase, again, a lot of people are like, oh my goodness, I've not had coffee for 9 months. I'm so excited to have some coffee. It's great. Unfortunately, caffeine is passed really easily into breast milk. And so they say kind of 2 to 3 hours after you've drunk coffee is when the caffeine content of your breast milk will be highest. So you may or may not notice that your baby perhaps gets a bit jittery or unhappy even after a feed. And and that could be due to caffeine content of the breast milk. So if you're finding that with your baby, perhaps again limit your caffeine intake, or make sure that it's spaced at kind of a regular interval, so it's maybe as far as you can get from a feed. But yeah, it's a tricky one because it's so many people lead a really healthy lifestyle, and like they'll be like, oh, caffeine is my one vice, I don't want to give it up, and I can totally get that. But for the long run, it's one of those things that's probably worth just limiting if you can.
Yeah, that's really interesting and really useful, I think, for people who are breastfeeding as well. I think if that's part, I didn't even realize that it's passed so easily into breast milk. So I think that's a super useful tip for those that are maybe struggling with that at the moment. I guess, are there any other tips through preconception, pregnancy, postpartum that you would kind of like to give to like a listener who's maybe on that journey at the moment and really struggling with their nutrition?
Yeah, I'd say generally, like everyone is so different, and that what works for one woman might not work for another woman. Um, and what works for you, like Monday to Friday, might not work for you Saturday, Sunday, and that's totally fine.
Yeah.
It's all about working out like how we can make these things work for us and how they can be sustainable. So I think a lot of the time when women come to me and ask for support, they think that I'm going to give them this wild diet plan, which is only like, I don't know, fish and rice for a month. But I am so like, I'm just so keen to make these changes like sustainable and supportive for women wherever they are at. I think it's really important to recognize that every small little change is like, even if it makes you like 1% better, that 1% is really important. And that accumulation of 1% is, yeah, incredible over time.
Yeah, definitely. I think you've hit the nail on the head there, where I feel like, particularly with pregnancy, there can be a lot of pregnancy shaming or mum shaming. And I think what you're doing in creating that manageable and supportive space for women is actually really inspiring, because I think it feels like daunting that you've got to be on this really like fad diet and do all these weird things to try and get like suddenly change your whole life around. But I think it is as simple as what you said, just switching to brown rice instead of white rice, or reducing your caffeine intake to 2 cups of tea a day. It's so easy to do. And I think people should just start making those small incremental steps, as you said, and really like they would reap the benefits from it.
Totally. And I think it's really important to know, like you said about mum shaming, and there's so much out there. It's really important to know where you're getting your information from. So I think one of the things for me as a dietitian is that we are, as a profession, we are really focused on like the evidence base and the science behind the recommendations. So we don't tend to be affiliated to like supplement companies or push any products in particular, because we want to make sure that what we're talking about has like really good evidence backing. So I run a blog via my website, and it's really important to me there that the information that I share about like pregnancy and fertility nutrition is like reputable, because we see so much on the internet, on social media, we see so much on the TV nowadays as well, that's just can be so overwhelming. And there's no way you can follow all of those dietary recommendations all at once. And so many of them are conflicting. So it's just important to know where you get your information from and make sure that it's like a trustworthy source.
Definitely. And I'll link your blog below, because it's got some really great information on there about different nutrition and diet and lifestyle tips, which I think is great. But I think also, as you kind of mentioned before, everyone is different. And I think that whole listening to your body and seeing what works for you instead of doing what some random diet that someone on the internet has posted because it's worked for them. I think you know what works for you best, and you can feel what works for you best. So I think that's really, yeah, definitely the way forward.
Yeah, totally. I definitely agree.
But I guess as we kind of bring it to the end, is there anything else that you would like to add?
I just think if you are someone who is concerned or have like a question, don't be concerned to ask for help. And if you have a concern that you have like a condition that you want to be looked into more, so like if you think you might have PCOS or endometriosis, don't be afraid to get tested. Don't be afraid to ask for a diagnosis, and maybe like do as much as you can, but don't be afraid to ask for help, because that's what people like, that's what me and you, and this is what so many healthcare professionals are here for. We're here to be that support network, so don't be worried about asking for one.
Oh, I think that's a lovely message to end on. And I honestly couldn't agree more. I will link all of your socials below. So anyone who wants to get in touch, then please get in touch. But I think I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to chat.
Always lovely to chat.